Now, in 12 days, maybe it's a little bit less now, the Women's Six Nations is going to kick off, and I'm delighted to say Alison Donnelly is with us to talk to us about this morning. Ali, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So listen, we actually wanted to get you on after you tweeted about the fact that we didn't know when the fixtures and kickoffs and where the broadcasts were going to be. In the last 24 hours, everything has been solved. The fixtures are published. We now know exactly who will be broadcasting the matches and when, but it is a bit late in the day, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, on a positive side, we got the fixtures now. We know where we can watch them, and there's quite a lot of broadcast activity going on. So most people will be able to watch most of the games in some way or other, either on the RTE or BBC or on Eurosport Player in France. So I think that's a good thing, first and foremost, to see lots of broadcast interest, because we need that. But yeah, I mean, I was just frustrated. I felt like, it was a slight backward step, actually. I've been writing about the Women's Six Nations for a long, long time, and I don't think we've ever gone this close to the wire in sort of knowing when you can watch the games. And I guess it's been a really positive few weeks for women's rugby. We've had World Rugby's big announcement of their 16-team tournament starting in 2023, and so it just felt like, this is a moment where we might actually be able to attract some sponsors, some commercial partners and so on, and yet we don't have our house in order, I think, in terms of presenting ourselves as a really professional sport, and a sport that is sort of ready to take the next step in terms of that commercial activity, which will be vital to taking women's rugby forward. So I was a bit disappointed. I think you have to have your own house in order if you want to take that step, and it didn't quite look like that. I think it just looked very bad.
And what's stopping rugby from having its house in order when it comes to the women's game at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a vicious circle, because you've got to be able to attract the kind of sponsorship and the investment that helps you to grow and to kind of maximize where you're going. But you're not going to get that if brands are looking at you and you look amateur and you look sort of unprofessional. So you've got to we need the people who are running the game to understand that. And I think for me it was particularly frustrating. I live in London, and the huge news this week for women's football, which is many, many years ahead of women's rugby in terms of its development, for sure. But you sort of had the two contrasting things. They were able to announce next season's fixtures and a huge broadcasting deal. And, you're almost, for me, running a website, writing women's rugby, apologetically begging for, fixture dates, which are just a week away. So I think it just presents itself as amateur. And the players, frankly, deserve a bit better. Most of the players in the Six Nations are amateur players, and, they want their families to watch, they want their friends to watch, just as a standard basic thing. And to not be able to tell them till the week before is disappointing. And it overshadows, I think, some really good stuff happening. And that's what I'd much rather be talking about.
Well, let's talk about the good stuff briefly so that we can cover that off. There's renewed chatter about a potential for a Lions tour at some point in the future. At least that conversation has started now. And once those conversations start, it's kind of hard to get the genie back at the bottle. You talked about the big announcement from World Rugby, and we covered it a little bit in the show. Now that the kind of dust has settled on the announcement, what practically do you think it will mean for the evolution of the women's game over the next decade or so?
Yeah, it's a hugely important step. I mean, the structure is definitely, it's not perfect, but I'm not sure there was a perfect structure when you're talking about a sport that only has a handful of really competitive teams at the top. And as soon as World Rugby said that there'd be a 16-team Women's Rugby World Cup in 2025, it had to do something, because we didn't have 16 competitive teams. So I think it's really important. And I think if you look at what actually happens in the test world in women's rugby, in the last calendar year before COVID, so talking January to December 2019, the top 16 teams in the world played an average of just 6 test matches. Australia only played 4. So, this tournament is actually going to give teams a significantly kind of improved number of games. So the minimum number of tests any of these 16 teams will play in a year will be 6, and the average will be much closer to 9. So I think that's really, really important. And also, talking about, making our game look more professional, having those 3 set windows, having regional qualifiers earlier in the year with a cutoff point, that is attractive to broadcasters, it's attractive to brands, because they're very specific packages, for want of a better way of saying it. So it's going to take time. It's not coming in for a couple of years because of the delay to the World Cup next year. But it's a really positive step, and there's a lot to sort out. But it's a good thing for the game, definitely.
So that's at the global level that has been sorted out. It seems as if the the problem around the Six Nations particularly is a more local and specific to the individual unions themselves. And it still seems kind of just that there's a sense that the women's game hasn't yet been taken as seriously by the unions as it needs to be, and that they're missing a trick there.
Well, some unions less than others. I think, you'd have to say that England and France in particular, they have seen the opportunity and they've invested in their programs and in their players and so on. But I think as well, we have an organising committee. There is a Six Nations organisation who are responsible for, more than just, I think what I was saying this week is, it's not, you can't consider a success just getting the games played. It's everything around it. It is finding a title sponsor. It is, kickoff times that don't overlap, which thankfully they don't this time. It is giving the teams, maximum game time. And I think back to the sort of positives, a lot of, I've certainly been asking for years through my writing anyway, for the Women's Six Nations to be moved. We have that now. It's got a standalone window. I would have preferred there to be the same number of games, and there aren't. But I think there are slow steps forward, and then it just seems to me that that there isn't quite the belief in the grasping of the opportunity. I know Brett Cosper's stepped down as the CEO of World Rugby now, but he used to say all the time, that the development of women in rugby is the single biggest opportunity for rugby to grow over the next decade. And I think we need everyone to believe that and to have the patience and the vision, to move the game forward and not sort of see it as, I wouldn't say it's box ticking, but to see it as something that is an add-on as opposed to something that actually can give the game, revenue in the future and profit in the future, ideally. But you have to put the steps in place, and I'm not entirely sure we saw that this week.
It'll be interesting then.
Revenue. So go on, sorry.
Sorry, well, I was just going to say it'll be interesting to see what happens then when WXV is implemented. If countries around the world almost have a positive influence on some of the Six Nations countries. Like we had Anna Capeless on last week, and she mentioned Canada and some of the great work they're doing, that a non-traditional rugby country like Canada could perhaps be having their house in order ahead of a country like Ireland potentially at that point. That influence might actually be a positive in the long run, even though that isn't how things should work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Canada's a really interesting comparison because Sevens has obviously given them a stream of investment that they never would have had before, because when you start playing sevens in an Olympic sport, you get access to other funding that 15s doesn't. So Canada's been able to kind of leverage the success that it's had on the sevens front into its 15s programs. But Canada should not be in terms of its structures and programs and investments ahead of Ireland. It just it doesn't have the same player base. It doesn't have the kind of historical investment in rugby. But I think I didn't hear Anna's interview, but if you've got people who are leading your game with vision and they understand how to bring money into the sport, then anybody can get ahead. Doesn't matter if you're considered one of those sort of tier one nations as we tend to look at rugby. Doesn't really matter. And women's rugby, it's still I wouldn't say it's a sport in its infancy anymore, but it's a growing sport. It's a growth sport. And you have to sort of have a vision when you are investing in or when you are building structures for a growth sport. It isn't something that you can sort of say, we'll do what we do for the men's game and it will happen. You've got to sort of be patient. And I say this a lot when I talk about, how you attract sponsors and investment. We need brands, organizations, unions, international federations who are patient and can see a long-term vision and, who will build the steps slowly. And it will be really interesting to see which countries step up to the plate in World Rugby's new tournament. But, it's still a long way off.
I think as well the media have a role to play, and particularly the terrestrial television broadcasters who have loads of space and have lost generally, like Premier League soccer, for example, is never going to be again, really, barring COVID, on terrestrial TV, but there's loads of space for them now, as we've seen with women's football. They can do the same as CBC, more than likely move stuff behind a paywall. I think there's a big opportunity for terrestrial broadcasters to step in, and particularly state broadcasters.
I 100% agree. I mean, I actually sort of tongue-in-cheek tweeted a couple of weeks ago that the great, men's rugby moving behind a paywall means, women's rugby might be the only kind of free-to-air rugby that people get to see. But I was only half joking, and there's an opportunity there for sure. And I think, in the Six Nations, Women's Six Nations coming up, BBC are showing some of the games on iPlayer, but they're showing the England's final game, BBC Two, and that's a huge step. We've actually never had here in the UK, we've never had a Women's Six Nations game on terrestrial television like that, which I had to check when I saw the press release that was true, but it is. And, I guess in Ireland, we've been lucky. I think RTE have done a really good job, and, they do show the games live and they do commit to it. So, it's really quite a big opportunity. And you mentioned women's football. The deal that the WSL through the FA have done here with Sky and BBC is really interesting, because they're getting both. They're getting that sort of income stream from pay TV, but also access to free-to-air audience, which when you're a growing sport is absolutely key. You need people to be able to see it.
On that WSL deal, Ali, I might be putting you on the spot here a little bit, but I know that obviously BT had a lot of the rights to that for a while, and I guess there was a little bit of experimentation with having the WSL behind a paywall. Is there an immediate future for that for women's rugby to go behind a paywall? Because obviously you get less eyeballs on it, full stop, if you want to attract new viewers. But sometimes it has been said about sport that the production quality is better. There's just a better attention put into it, and those people who are flicking between the sports channels anyway will have a passion about what they're watching anyway. And I think that point has been made about the men's Six Nations maybe potentially going behind a paywall, that people who really want it will get it. What is your opinion on that, and how pay companies have dealt with women's sport, I guess, over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the broadcasters here, BT, Sky, etc., should be commended, I think, for taking taking a leap into the unknown in some ways with women's sports. They didn't know what kind of audiences they'd get, and Sky show women's netball here, and you mentioned BT in the football. I mean, my challenge for that is that with the growth sport, and women's rugby absolutely is, it is really risky to put it behind a paywall, because sure, the small kind of dedicated audience will find it, but it is a small dedicated audience right now, in part because it's so hard to watch it, and it hasn't really been given the opportunity. I mean, I think the great comparison probably is when we had the Women's Football World Cup in 2019 on the BBC, and the audiences were, 10 million, upwards of 10 million, it's huge here because people could watch it, and you would never get that, those numbers. And it's a World Cup, it's different, but you wouldn't get those numbers watching a comparable WSL game on BT Sports, in part because pay TV obviously gives you a smaller audience. So I would much prefer, although, in some ways, you can't be choosers always when, you're coming to the party with smaller numbers to offer, there to be free to air. And I think that's why the women's football deal is so extraordinary, because they've managed to do both. They've managed this really proper kind of successful looking hybrid where there will be some pay TV games for, that'll give them some interesting revenue streams, but there will also be an opportunity for everybody else to watch it on the BBC. And, we're miles away from that in women's rugby. I mean, this is years down the line, but I do think one of the things that has been interesting has been the streaming. So I know the quality is not always as good, but it's important, I think, to, a lot of the test games in the last few years, 2018-19 in women's rugby, were streamed, and more unions are putting investment into that. You can watch, for example, almost all of the Women's Premier 15s league here, the Allianz 15s it's called, on some stream or other, and a lot of clubs invest in commentary too. So that is also a sort of a slightly different package that, perhaps could be monetized.
Yeah, it's a nice little ecosystem when you put it all together. Ali, I had one last question. You talked about the investment that the English and the French rugby unions in particular, and the professionalism of the women's teams that they have. Ireland obviously had done well almost a decade ago at this point with a team that kind of captured the imagination of the public and that beat the All Blacks. And it seems like we made the decision strategically to back our sevens team and to invest in the women's game that way. Looking back now, is it hindsight? And I know a lot of people at the time were saying that was the wrong thing to do. Should we have continued to invest in the 15?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the RFU would say that they have, but I think, in fairness to them, nobody really knew what to do with their women's sevens programs. And some countries, just went for it with sevens and invested everything into that. Other countries, decided not to do that. And no one really knew. It was very early days. You suddenly had, after 2009, there's an Olympic program and all this new funding came into the sport, and no one really knew how quite to work it. Particularly, I suppose, if a country like Ireland doesn't have huge playing numbers. And I don't know the latest figures that the RFU have, but I suspect it's not more than a couple of thousand adult women playing. So it's a tiny, comparably to the countries they're competing with, and the player base is very small. So I give them a little bit of slack for that. I think what has failed to happen is, building on the success of that team out of 2014, in 2015 in particular, we haven't really had that, and it's been confusing. Where is the focus? Is it sevens? Is it 15s? And Ireland, they haven't qualified for the World Cup yet, and I think that would be an enormous failure. I think they will qualify for the World Cup, and I think they'll do probably quite well over the next year or so. They seem to have a team with a good mix of experience, some youngsters coming through. It'd be great to watch them play in a few weeks' time against Wales, just to see where teams are at. I mean, no one's played in a year. England and France have played. But I think it's hard to say, the wrong thing or the right thing was done with 7s or 15s. Everybody was finding their way with it. But I think they need to be very clear now about what the future is and where their investment will go, because they will fall behind. If we have a top 6 tier, the tier 1 of this new league structure, and Ireland want to be in that, they're going to have to be investing, and they're going to have to be investing in their players too, because you've got a fully professional England team, a semi-pro France team. It's going to be hard to keep up with those teams unless you have kind of clear pathways, clear structures, and clear investments.
100%. Ali, always great to talk to you. Thanks a million for joining us this morning. Cheers.
Thank you both.